Brent Spiner spent decades playing the one character on television who was built never to feel frustration, irritation, or resentment. Data was an android, incapable of anger by design. And yet, at 77 years old, Spiner has openly admitted the role frustrated him more than almost anything else in his career. Not the multi-hour transformations. Not the alien dialogue. Something else entirely. One that had nothing to do with the show itself. And something that still happens to him decades later, every single time he leaves his house, in front of total strangers, without warning. Ask Brent Spiner what actually bothers him about playing Data, and the answer isn't what most people expect. It isn't the hours in a makeup chair. It isn't the physical toll of the job. It's one word, shouted at him by strangers on the street, in restaurants, in airports, decades after Star Trek. The next generation went off the air. People see him, recognize his face instantly, and yell out Data. Not his name. Not even a polite acknowledgement that they recognize the actor underneath the character. Just the character's name, shouted like a command, as if Spiner himself had somehow disappeared into the role permanently. He said he doesn't mind being recognized at all. Recognition comes with the job, and he understands that completely. What actually gets under his skin is being erased in the process, reduced to the android he played instead of being seen as the man who played him. A distinction that might sound small until you imagine strangers doing it to you every single week for close to 40 straight years. He's been fairly direct about it over the years. Spiner has said that sometimes he feels the role limited him professionally in ways he wishes it hadn't, though he's also been clear that it isn't something he had any control over once it happened. He's even leaned into the frustration with humor, telling the Washington Post, "I, frankly, like to think I've been typecast as the reason when I don't get jobs, because the alternative is that I'm just lousy." That's a strange thing to sit with for a working actor. You take a role that changes your life, makes you internationally recognizable, opens doors that would otherwise stay shut, and then discover that the very same role can quietly close other doors behind you, the ones marked "this actor can play something other than an android." What makes this complaint interesting isn't the complaint itself. It's the contrast. Spiner never set out to become the human face of an emotionless machine forever. In 1991, while the show was still airing, he even leaned into the joke himself, releasing an album of pop standards called "Old Yellow Eyes Is Back," a wink at both Data's contact lenses and Frank Sinatra's own famous comeback record. That kind of self-aware humor suggests he was never bitter about the association early on. The frustration crept in later gradually, as the years piled up and the character's name became the only name strangers seemed to remember. He barely wanted the part in the first place, and the story of how he actually landed the role of Data explains a lot about why the character ended up defining him so completely. Here's something that surprises a lot of longtime fans. Brent Spiner wasn't chasing the role of Data because he loved science fiction. By his own account, he wasn't even a particularly big fan of the original Star Trek series growing up, and he had genuine doubts that this new 1987 spin-off would last more than a season or two. He took the audition, and eventually the job, mostly because it paid the bills. There was no grand childhood dream driving him toward Data. It was a working actor's decision, plain and simple, made by a man who had already spent years grinding through Broadway and off-Broadway stages, and who had reportedly driven a cab in New York City during the leaner stretches. That casting process was closer than most people realize, and stranger too. An internal studio memo from that period shows just how differently the whole cast could have looked. The same document that weighed Spiner for Data was also considering Wesley Snipes for the role that eventually went to LeVar Burton, and floating Yaphet Kotto as a candidate for the captain's chair that ultimately went to Patrick Stewart. For Data specifically, producers were comparing Spiner against at least 3 other actors, Mark Lindsay Chapman, Kelvin Han Yee, and Eric Meneuk, who came so close to landing the part that producers gave him a recurring role as the Traveler. Also in the mix was Kevin Peter Hall, the 7'2" actor famous for playing the Predator. Hall didn't land the part, but producers liked him enough to cast him in a guest appearance. Tragically, Hall passed away in 1991 from complications related to AIDS. Spiner got the part, and the character that came out of it borrowed conceptual DNA from an unexpected place. The android bishop from the film Aliens, a calm, precise synthetic figure whose quiet competence under pressure clearly influenced how Data's creators imagined their own artificial crew member. Nobody involved in the casting process, least of all Spiner, seemed to fully grasp what they were building. What looked like just another supporting role turned into one of the most demanding, regular jobs in television. Long before Data ever said a word on screen, Brent Spiner had already spent close to 90 minutes becoming him. Even before filming began, producers experimented with exactly what the character should look like. Early makeup tests reportedly gave Data a pinker, more human-toned skin, and the production debated giving him a tangerine-eye color before settling on the pale gold skin and chartreuse yellow eyes that became iconic. Once that design was locked in, it became Spiner's daily reality for years, sitting still while a beige-based foundation went on his entire face, followed by a careful mix of pale and bright gold powders. Then came a dark wig, precisely applied sideburns, and finally the part Spiner has said he actually dreaded the most, the yellow contact lenses. He's described the whole process bluntly as a nightmare, and singled out the contacts as the worst piece. Wearing colored lenses for hours at a time, day after day, across years of production, came with real physical consequences, including eye irritation and infections that built up over the length of the show's run. In a typically self-deprecating post on X, he once wrote, "This February, Star Trek will be celebrating 25 years since my first eye infection. No gifts, please." To his credit, Spiner has also said the experience wasn't miserable the entire way through, largely because of the makeup supervisor, Michael Westmore, who Spiner has described as a genuinely skilled collaborator. There's a small irony buried in that praise. Westmore went on to win multiple Emmy Awards for his makeup designs. Spiner, the actor doing the actual performing underneath all of that gold paint, never won a single Emmy for playing Data. That detail matters, because it shows the makeup wasn't really the core of Spiner's frustration. It was a genuine physical burden, but one he came to accept as part of the job. The far bigger problem was waiting for him after the makeup chair, once filming actually started. Here's the part of playing Data that almost nobody outside the production ever saw: the sheer volume of dialogue Spiner had to memorize night after night, with almost no room for error. During the show's early seasons, the cast was cranking out roughly 26 episodes a year, and Data consistently had some of the densest, most technical dialogue on the entire show. Across the full run of The Next Generation, Spiner would appear in around 176 episodes, plus 4 feature films. Part of what made Data's lines especially punishing wasn't just length, it was content. Data scripts were frequently loaded with dense technical exposition and invented scientific terminology. That kind of dialogue doesn't come with the same natural rhythm as ordinary conversation, which made it significantly harder to memorize. Spiner has talked about coming home after shooting days that stretched 16 hours or longer, and instead of collapsing into bed, opening up the next day's script with his stomach turning over from the pressure. He set himself an unforgiving rule. He wasn't allowed to sleep until he could recite the entire next day's dialogue perfectly. He's admitted there were plenty of nights that rule cost him sleep entirely. The pressure eventually became visible enough that producers started restructuring how episodes were built, shifting toward a format where certain episodes centered specifically on Data, others on Picard, others on Riker, spreading the heaviest dialogue loads out. That adjustment helped, but it came only after Spiner had already spent seasons running on almost no margin for error. And even after that, one single week nearly proved to be the moment his self-imposed system finally failed him. There's one specific stretch Spiner has talked about that stands out. He just wrapped an exhausting run, carrying an entire episode almost entirely on his own. He was relieved it was ending, looking forward to an episode that would center on somebody else. Then the next script arrived, and it turned out to be another data-centered episode, except this one required him to play 5 separate characters. He described getting anxious just looking at the pages, to the point that he called one of the show's producers, Jerry Taylor, and told her he didn't think he could pull it off. Her response was short. She told him she had faith in him. Somehow he did it. The episode was called Masks, and its plot required Data to channel 5 entirely separate personalities from a long-dead alien civilization. Spiner has since said he mostly remembers it because of how much feedback it generated. By his own description, some of the acting he did was some of the most over-the-top work of his career. The most memorable moment came near the end of the shoot, around 2 in the morning, when Spiner and Patrick Stewart were filming a scene together and simply could not stop laughing at each other long enough to finish the take. That single week captures what actually made playing Data hard. It was the sheer, grinding physical demand of the job, stacked on top of itself, week after week for years. For all the physical strain, Data did make Brent Spiner a genuine industry success story. His work in the role earned him a Saturn Award for Best Supporting Actor for his performance in Star Trek: First Contact. Around that same period, he also picked up a nomination for playing Dr. Brackish Oaken in Independence Day. What makes the Saturn win sting a little, in hindsight, is what never came alongside it. Across the entire run, Spiner didn't just play Data. He also played Data's cruel brother-in-law, Data's creator Dr. Noonien Sung, and the prototype android B4, meaning he was regularly asked to build and distinguish for separate characters. His castmate Patrick Stewart later wrote that Spiner's range across those roles was staggeringly good. Despite all of that, Spiner was never nominated for a single Emmy. Stewart himself has called that outcome a genuine injustice. Across its entire 7-season run, The Next Generation was rarely recognized in major acting categories, earning most of its nominations in technical fields. Spiner didn't sit still waiting for recognition, either. Even while playing Data full-time, he kept working the stage, later returning to Broadway to play John Adams in a revival of the musical 1776, a performance that earned him a Drama Desk nomination. Fans noticed the same pattern. Whatever Data was asked to do that week, comedic, tragic, robotic, or fully human, Spiner was the one doing the heavy lifting underneath the gold paint. That range never fully translated into mainstream recognition, which is exactly the frustration Spiner has pointed to. Being brilliant as Data didn't necessarily open the door to being cast as anyone else. If anything, the more definitive his performance became, the harder it got for audiences and casting directors to picture him as anyone other than the android. This is a story about a bitter actor resenting his most famous role. In a much more ordinary human tension, loving a job, being genuinely great at it, and also recognizing that the very thing that made you famous was slowly narrowing the range of parts anyone would ever offer you again. By the time the fourth feature film, Nemesis, wrapped in 2002, Brent Spiner made a quiet decision that stuck for nearly 2 decades. He stepped away from Data entirely. In that film, Data sacrifices himself to save the rest of the crew. On screen, Data was gone. The reasoning behind it wasn't burnout from the makeup chair. It came down to something more fundamental. Data was designed as an android who doesn't age. As the years went by and Spiner visibly grew older, the gap between the actor's real face and the ageless machine became harder to paper over convincingly. Spiner was acutely aware of this. He reflected years later, "I was 38 when I started playing Data. So it occurred to me, how long is this going to last? I looked pretty young for my age at the time, but I thought, if I was 10 years younger, I could play this for 30 years. But I wasn't. I was pushing 40. So for a long stretch, Spiner simply didn't return to the role. During those years away, he kept working steadily, including voicing the Joker in Young Justice. For years, that seemed like the permanent end of his time as Data. Except it wasn't permanent at all. Roughly 2 decades after Nemesis, Brent Spiner returned to Star Trek for the series Picard. By his own account, the decision came down to fear of missing out, a pull toward being part of a story he'd helped originate. Bringing him back meant the writers had to explain how a character who had sacrificed himself could return. The show leaned into that complication, building a storyline around memory engrams Data had passed along, eventually reconstructing his consciousness inside a new body. What made this return different was how they handled Data's appearance. Instead of forcing Spiner back into hours of gold paint and a dark wig, the production found a clever workaround. Data's consciousness was placed into a brand new synthetic body designed to simply look like Brent Spiner in his 70s. His own gray hair, his own natural skin. The only piece of the original design they kept was the chartreuse-colored contact lenses. It was a small storytelling choice, with a much bigger practical effect. For the first time since the character debuted, Spiner could return to playing Data without enduring the physical routine he'd once described as a nightmare. The makeup chair marathon was gone. The contact lens strain was drastically reduced. Even the core tension that had pushed him away, the discomfort of playing something that couldn't age while he obviously had, was written into the story. Data himself was allowed to look older. In a strange way, the very frustration that defined so much of Spiner's time playing Data, the exhausting transformation, the punishing memorization, the sense of being reduced to a single character in the eyes of strangers, all led eventually to a version of the role that finally let him just be Brent Spiner, 70-something years old, playing an android without pretending to be anything he wasn't anymore. And even now, at 77, Spiner remains busy. He has a new podcast with Jonathan Frakes called Dropping Names with Brent and Johnny. He's also been active in voice acting, recently reprising his role in Star Trek, Lower Decks. If the role that made Brent Spiner famous was also the role he says limited him, cost him sleep, wore down his eyes, and never earned him the industry recognition his castmates believe he deserved, did Data end up being the best thing that ever happened to his career, or the role he spent almost 40 years trying to step out of? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching.